press recording. Thank you for somebody who did that for me. Let me start this over again. Welcome tonight to this first of 3 nights of our extension of the Biblical Leadership Conference. My name is Mark Ray. I'm Executive Director of the Grace Center for Spiritual Development, and it's my pleasure to be able to welcome you this evening. We've got a number of people that are joining online. If you'll look to the very top of your screen, you'll see that you've got an opportunity to mute yourself on that little microphone. To the right, you can put a chat questions going on because there'll be chats going on and off all during the time. We'll have an open time for question and answer. Tonight, you're going to be listening to myself and a good friend of mine, Carlen Charleston. I'm going to be speaking on leadership lessons from the life of Moses. He's going to be speaking on leadership lessons from the life of Joseph on April 2nd. 2 other good friends of mine, Sam Newton and Dr. Al Lenning, are going to be speaking on leadership lessons from David and from Nehemiah. And then on April 9th, Dr. Johnny Seago on the leadership lessons from the life of Deborah, and Dr. Paul Landrew, leadership lessons on the life of Elijah. So that's what's coming up. We hope that you will join us. You're going to also hear a number of things from us during the course of these next several weeks with some of these speakers. We're going to be having some of our live interviews on our Grace Cafe. You can also listen to each one of our speakers and comments that they made, workshops that they did for the leadership conference that we had back in February on our Grace app. If you'll go to your app store and plug in the Grace app and download it, you'll be able to get them and the lessons that they taught during the Biblical Leadership Conference we had. So I want to welcome you once again to this extension of the Biblical Leadership Conference. As we head into the summer and into the fall again, we are planning on a second leadership conference coming up again next February. It'll be part 2 to this, and we're looking really forward to that. But let's get launched into this. Tonight, you're going to be hearing from me, leadership lessons from Moses, and also from my friend Carlen Charleston on leadership lessons from Joseph. I'm going to be in Exodus chapter 18, if you're interested and want to get your Bibles out and turn there. So let me pray, and I will get us started. Father God, we thank you for this opportunity to have people from all around the world chime in, be a part of this. And even in the midst of the coronavirus that's circling the globe, we thank you that you have given us technology that allows us to stay connected, allows us to be able to continue to learn and train and study and learn the ways that you have put in front of us. Thank you for the life of Moses and the life of Joseph. And pray for my brother Carlen and the message he will bring later this evening. Thank you for his preparation and the opportunity to hear from him as his excitement about the life of Joseph pours out of him. And I thank you for what you have taught me in the life of Moses. I pray that these are principles, leadership principles that people can take and use and apply to their daily lives. And God, that you would be raising up, as is it's the mission and the vision of Grace School of Theology and the Grace Center for Spiritual Development, raising up spiritual leaders that can teach people all around the world about the love of Christ, a love that cannot be earned and cannot be lost. We give you thanks for that, and we pray tonight that you would rest this message and these messages heavily on people who need to hear them. So bless us and be in our time together. Open our ears to hear what you have to say in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, again, welcome. Thank you for being a part of this. Let me say one more time across the top, we're going to be moderating your microphones and your video. But at the same time, if you've got questions, unmute yourself and you can ask those questions. You can put them in the chat on the right-hand side. We've got people monitoring those as well. So we're going to launch in. Turn to Exodus chapter 18, and while you're turning there, I want you to hear a couple of things about just the term leader and about the term leadership. If you go to Webster's Dictionary defines the term leader simply as one who guides. And then it defines one who guides as one who shows the way. A very different definition than we may get from the worldly perspective of the term leader, one who guides, and a guide is one who shows the way. I want to give you one of my favorite stories to start this whole evening out. When I was young, I was on a street. We lived on a street in Houston, Texas. It was a U-shaped street, and our house was right where the U came together. All the games and all the kids played every game right out in front of our house, in the street right in front of our house. One of our favorite games was touch football. We loved playing touch football, and the boundaries were easily set up for certain trees. End zones were certain people's houses. We had all sorts of rules and regulations to the game because we're playing in the street. There, you couldn't tackle, it was touch. You had to be careful because of the concrete that was underneath our feet. But we would split up into two sides, and typically we chose sides. And as we began, you could see the teams form and you could see the game begin. Well, it would be an interesting thing to watch when one team, the offense, would go into the huddle and begin to plan the play that they were going to run. Because what you could hear would be, okay, Billy, you be the bottle cap. Okay, Tommy, you be the rock. Okay, Sammy, you be the piece of glass. And what you consistently heard was, I don't want to be the bottle cap. I want to be the piece of glass. I don't want to be the piece of glass. I want to be the rock. I don't want to be the rock. I want to be... And we would end up arguing more about that type of situation than we would the actual play. Well, all of that would change when my neighbor across the street, young boy by the name of Ricky, would enter the game. And the reason it would change was Ricky was a little bit older than any of us. He had played football in junior high. He was well schooled in this. And anytime Ricky entered the game, the entire outcome of the game shifted. And it shifted because Ricky was a natural born leader. The interesting thing about Ricky was he would walk into the street and he would say, which side's losing? And the losing side would hold their hand up and he'd go join that side. The minute he joined that side, the game shifted because Ricky was on that team. And I remember distinctly us sitting in the huddle and we started our argument of who was the bottle cap and who was the piece of glass and who was the rock. And Ricky would not have any of it. He would decide who was the bottle cap, who was the rock, but he was more interested in laying out the play and making sure that the kids who were in the huddle got a chance to actually play. Whether it was a handoff, whether it was a pass, he really knew how to understand who it was he had in his team and how to actually use them. When Ricky played, the game shifted. And it shifted dramatically because Ricky, the natural-born leader, came into the game. It was my first lesson in what a leader really looks like. And the reason why that keeps drawing attention is Ricky was a leader primarily because of how he treated us. He treated us not below him. He treated us as teammates. He treated us as ones who he could use their skills to be able to help win the game. And we all felt like we were part of the team, and you knew when Ricky came on your side, things were going to shift and things were going to change. He was a leader in the definition that Webster's dictionary gives, one who guides and one who shows the way, because he always planned the plays. He knew what we needed to do. He knew how we needed to do it. Listen to what Jack Kemp, former NFL quarterback and 1996 vice presidential candidate, said about leaders. He said, sports provides invaluable lessons in leadership that are applicable for all of us in all situations. He said, a leader is not solely defined by his or her position because everyone is a leader. Now, I want to make sure you heard that. Everyone is a leader. He went on to say, in life, most of us spend a fair amount of time on the bench at one time or another, but that does not mean we're not in the game. We don't have to be first stringers to have an impact. We are constantly influencing and shaping the lives of countless people around us. That's what a leader does. A leader constantly influences and helps shape the lives of people around them. So if what Jack Camp said is true about everyone being a leader and influencing people, then the question of the evening is this: what makes a good leader? What are those characteristics of a leader that stand out? We're going to get a chance to take a look at the life of Moses and one specific incident in the life of Moses. And my challenge is this: it is that what the Bible tells us about leadership is drastically different from what the world tells us leadership is. And I'm going to show you that, given the fact that I spent 25 years in business leading groups of people, and I have spent 20 years in ministry leading groups of people. And I've come to learn these instances, these principles, these characteristics of a leader that come out of Moses play over and over and over and over again. And I believe they form the backbone of what makes a good leader. So we're in Exodus chapter 18. I want to kind of give you the running start into this section. Exodus 14 and 15 is where we get the actual Exodus, the parting of the Red Sea, the magnificence of what God produces. We move into 16 and 17, where we now find them in the wilderness wandering, and we hear the nation of Israel complaining after complaining after complaining about their situation. There's no food, there's no water. We finally get to chapter 18, and this is the time in which Moses has now begun to set up a structure for how people can bring their complaints and their issues to Moses as God's representative to be able to talk to people about what's going on. We find at the beginning of chapter 18 that Moses' father-in-law Jethro, Jethro comes onto the scene. He arrives. He brings Moses' family with him. And at the first part of chapter 18, what he finds out is this: Moses tells Jethro, because Jethro has heard through the grapevine that God did a miraculous thing in Egypt. He's now brought the family there, and he says, Moses, tell me all about it. So Moses begins to unfold the magnificence of what God did in the Exodus. We find that Jethro, and I love chapter 18, verse 11, Jethro says this: now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them. Where the gods would boast, and actually it was the people boasting on behalf of the gods, God showed himself to be even above those gods. Moses makes the statement very specifically that God is above all. He is the God who is above all gods. And so they rejoice. Jethro and Moses rejoice, and they have a wonderful evening together, rejoicing in the fact that God has delivered the people out of Pharaoh's hand. And then we get to verse 13. And now the day-to-day of the nation of Israel in the wilderness begins to take place. And here's the backdrop. Verse 13, it says, and so it was on the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. Now, to put a little context here, Moses was the leader of the nation of Israel, taking them out of Exodus. But it was about 2 million people, most scholars believe. So he is trying to manage singularly 2 million people. So when the scriptures, and I think they're a little bit underplaying this scenario here, when the scriptures tell us that Moses sat to judge the people, what he is judging is their issues that are coming before him. The people stood before Moses from morning until evening. Have you ever stood in a line that seemed to last forever? Maybe you're at the post office. Maybe you're at the Department of Transportation getting your driver's license. Maybe you're in a checkout line, and it seems to last forever. You begin to think about other things you could be doing. You begin to think about what a waste of time this is. You begin to complain. You begin to moan. And you begin to get tired of it. I've actually sat in lines long enough that I've seen people just put their stuff down and leave. Moses has got people who have real issues coming to him, and they're standing in line for hours upon hours. In fact, some of them stand in line from morning until evening. So Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, sees what all is happening, and he comes to Moses and he says this: what is this thing that you're doing for the people? In other words, what good are you doing for the people? Why do the people sit? Why do you alone sit, and all the people stand before you from morning until evening? Why in the world are you the only one who has the authority and the power to do this? Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me to inquire of God. They come to inquire about the statutes, about the laws, about how God would answer the issues that they're bringing forward. Verse 16, when they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one and another. I make known the statutes of God and his laws. The backdrop to this is Moses is the only go-to guy. And now we begin to see the principles of leadership begin to play out. We're going to look at verses 17 through 27. And we start in verses 17 through 19. I want to read the verses and then just unfold this for you, because what we're going to see here is what I believe J. Oswald Sanders says is the reason why, as he says, real leaders today are in short supply. Because I believe the principles of leadership that are unfolded, the characteristics of leadership that are unfolded here are difficult. They're not easy. But we're going to see them unfolded in the life of Moses. Verse 17, so Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you do is not good. Now, just understand, this is the father-in-law talking to his son-in-law, and he's just said, everything I've watched you do in the last day, you're doing it wrong. You're not doing it right. This is not a good thing for your people. He says, both you and these people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out, for this thing is too much for you. You're not able to perform it by yourself. Verse 19, listen now to my voice. I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. Stand before God for the people so that you may bring the difficulties to God. What we see, first of all, that happens is Jethro takes stock of the situation, and he recognizes what Moses has not been able to recognize. The situation that you have set up is not a good one. Principle number one, first characteristic of a leader is that he needs to be a listening leader. Here's what I would have done. So my father-in-law comes to me and says, the thing that you do is not good. Immediately, my ears would have closed and my mouth would have gone to defending myself. I would have immediately said, you don't understand the situation. God's called me to be the one, to be the judge. I'm the one who's got to do this. I'm sorry the people have to wait in line so long. This is the way it's got to be. But notice that Moses doesn't respond that way. Notice that the first thing Jethro says to him is, you're doing it wrong. Let me begin to show you a better way. And Moses listens. The first thing we learn of a listening leader is that he learns to listen to others. He learns to listen to those around him. My father ran a company for years and years and years, long before quality assurance programs came out. The quality assurance programs that used to tell you the answers to the problems in your company, especially in a production company, come from the shop floor, where the people who are actually doing the work know the answers. You need to go listen to them. My dad would go out on the shop floor every single morning, and he would talk to people. Every single morning, he would hear from them. Every single morning, he would listen to what they had to say, and he would take them and bring them into leadership meetings so that they could help answer the problems that were arising. The first part of a listening leader is that they listen to others, those who are in line. For Moses to hear the ones who are in line. The second thing is they listen to wise counsel. A listening leader listens to wise counsel. Jethro was bringing wise counsel. And notice that Moses never says a word. He listens to the wise counsel of his father-in-law. The third thing, and the third part of being a listening leader, is what we hear when Jethro says, listen now to my voice, I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. The third one, and the most important one, maybe we should put this first, is that a listening leader listens to the counsel of God. First and foremost, a listening leader listens to the counsel of God. Jethro was sent by God to tell him there is a better way to do this. First characteristic we call a listening leader. Now, here's what the world tells us. The world tells us you're the leader, you've got to lead, it's all about you, which is where Moses was. What we see in his movement is that Moses becomes a listening leader. He puts into practice the characteristic of listening, and he listens to others, he listens to the wise counsel of Jethro, and he listens most of all to God, to the issues that are going on. Now, let me tell you, for anyone, if you go back to Jack Kemp's definition of a leader, that everyone is a leader, here's what I'll tell you. You not only lead those people around you, but you also lead and influence your family, your spouse, your kids. And my question would be, how are you involving them? Are you listening to those around you? Or is it all about you? First characteristic, a listening leader. Now, I warn you, they get a little bit more difficult after this. It's why we hear scriptural principles of be slow to speak, be quick to hear, listen first. I love the fact that somebody once said that's why God gives us 2 ears and 1 mouth. We need to engage both ears first as a leader. We become a listening leader. The second we see in verse 20. Verse 20. Jethro goes on and he says, you shall teach them the statutes and the laws, show them the way in which they must walk, and the work they must do. Verse 20 points out the second characteristic of a leader, and it's what I call the living leader. The living leader. And here's what I mean by that. We see in the first statement, Jethro says, you, Moses, shall teach them the statutes and the laws. The first thing we see of a living leader is one who teaches others. They teach others. They don't hold all the knowledge to themselves. They teach others. So what he says to Moses is the first thing is you need to lead by schooling others. You need to lead by teaching others. Teach them what you know. Don't simply speak at them, teach them. Then he says, not only do you teach them, he says, but now you show them the way. The second thing a living leader does, first thing is he teaches, he schools them. The second thing is he shows them. He becomes the living example of what he's trying to say. It's one thing to tell somebody something, it's another thing to actually show them. And a leader not only teaches, but a leader shows. The third thing he says is this, that you must do the work that they must do. Show them the work that they must do. The third thing a living leader does is he leads by sharing his life, actually getting down and doing the work with them. This is what a living leader does. A living leader leads by teaching. A living leader leads by showing, being that example, and a living leader actually leads by sharing, putting your own life on display, showing them you and how you interact in that situation. I love the old illustration about General Eisenhower. He said he would demonstrate the art of leadership with the simple principle of a string. He'd lay a string on the table and he'd say, pull it, and it will follow you wherever you want it to go. Push it, and it will go nowhere at all. It's just that way when it comes to leading people. They need to follow a person who is leading by example, pulling them with him. First characteristic of a leader, being a listening leader. Second characteristic of a leader, being a living leader. And actually, this flies in the face of what the world tells us today. The world tells us today, you lead, and they do the work. The living leader is one who actually lives it out, teaches them, shows them, and shares his life with them. We now move to verses 21 and 22, and we see the third characteristic of a leader here. Jethro continues, and he says, moreover, you shall select from all the people able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. And let them judge the people at all times. Then it will be that every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they themselves shall judge. So it will be easier for you, for they will bear the burden with you. I call this one the liberating leader. And I call it the liberating leader for these three reasons. The first thing we see in the liberating leader is what Jethro says. Select from all the people able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. The first thing that the liberating leader does is he is a discerning leader of others. He discerns their gifts, their talents, their skills for specific purposes. He is a discerning leader who looks for those skills and talents. There was an old statement about saying it's not enough to just get the right people on the bus, but you have to put the right people in the right seats. That's what makes the company go. That's what makes the business work. That's what makes a leader happen. A liberating leader first is discerning of others. Second, notice that he says, once you have found these men, place them as rulers over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. He says the next situation that you have is you're not only a discerner of others, but you're decisive when you make those decisions. So once you found those people, make the decisive decision to put them in those positions of leadership. The third one is, he says in verse 22, and then let them judge the people at all times. Let them determine the big issues and the little issues. They handle the little issues, they bring the big issues to you, and therefore the burden is off of them and off of you. The third one is the liberating leader knows when to delegate, to let others go, to let them go do the work. So you find them, you're discerning in the proper people to put in the proper places. You're decisive to allow them to take the position of authority. And then as a liberating leader, you delegate that responsibility to them. Now, let me tell you, this isn't easy. And I'll give you an example in my own life from my two sons. I have two boys. They're both grown now with families. But when they were both around 12 to 14 years old, I always had the responsibility to mow the yard. Mow it, edge it, blow it, keep it clean. I began to teach my boys when they got to be 12, 13 years old to mow the yard. And how I did it was I had them walk with me, them in front, me behind them as they pushed the mower. And I showed them how to do that, how to hold the edger, how to use the blower. I have to admit I was a little bit OCD because I had them do it the way I wanted them to do it. So the grass was cut exactly the right way. And it looked exactly the way I wanted it to look. But at some point in time, I had to let them go. I had to say, now I've taught them, now I've trained them, they're ready to do this. I've made the decision to put them in charge, and now I have to release them. The interesting thing is, first of all, they did a great job, but we see this go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, when God says to Adam, take dominion over my creation, tend my garden. You see, God did exactly the same thing with us, because that command is still there for us to tend his garden, to still do the work that he has given us to do. And he's given us that responsibility to do the work here. God has seen us, put us in those positions based on our skills, talents, and gifts, and then allowed us to be able to have dominion over his creation, to do the work, to tend his garden. This is what a liberating leader does. Finds the right people, makes the decision to put them in the right places, and then delegates the responsibility because he's found the right people. The listening leader, the living leader, the liberating leader. The world tells us today, if you want it done right, you got to do it by yourself. The liberating leader says, I find the right people. I release them. I delegate the responsibility and release them. We come to a fourth, and we see this in verses 23 and 24. Jethro says, if you do this thing and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all this people will also go to their place in peace. That must tell us, first of all, that there was not a whole lot of peace in the line of people waiting to get in to see Moses. But verse 24 says, so Moses heeded the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. This one I call the learning leader. Characteristic number 4 is a leader who understands he's got to learn. He's got to continue to learn. He doesn't know it all. In fact, the world tells you, you're the leader, you do know it all. The learning leader, the characteristic of leadership that Moses shows us is that the learning leader understands he doesn't know it all. The first thing we see of a learning leader is he strives to follow God. I love the fact that Jethro puts in here that this brings about peace. He says, if you do this thing and God so commands you, you will be able to endure. There will be peace if you follow what God tells you to do. So the learning leader, first of all, strives to follow God, learning from God that he doesn't know it all. The second thing that a learning leader does is he strives for unity. He learns to compromise, that his ways aren't always the right way. And he learns to compromise in this. And the third thing is, the learning leader always strives for improvement, learning that he needs to learn. It's an interesting thing that a leader still needs to learn. Here's a fascinating fun fact. This is a freebie for you. In the Greek, the word disciple literally translates to this, learner. A disciple is one who learns. If we're a disciple of Jesus Christ, we are ones who learn continually how to follow him. We learn how to live this Christian life as a follower of Jesus Christ. I'll say it again, the world tries to tell you you're the boss, you have to know it all. A good leader understands that they have to continually learn. They have to constantly learn. And you can now begin to see these characteristics lining up one after the other. You can see that if you're listening, you're learning. You can see that if you're absolutely going out and showing people the right way, if you are this living leader and living it out by example, then all of a sudden you're going to find the right people. As you begin to release them, delegate the authority, they learn and you learn. These all play roles together as we bring this about to a final one, and perhaps the most difficult one. And I will tell you, this is the one why I think Oswald Chambers says it. Spiritual leaders are in short supply today. True spiritual leaders are in short supply today. And I think it's because of this last characteristic. Coming out verses 25 through 27. And Moses chose able men out of all of Israel, made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. So they judged the people at all times. The hard cases they brought to Moses, but they judged every small case themselves. Then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way to his own land. The assumption here, and I'm going to use this as the assumption, is that Moses was a loving leader because he loved his people. The reason why he did what his father-in-law commanded him, why his father-in-law told him, was that Moses loved the people. He absolutely did not like the fact that they had to stand in line all day, but he didn't see another way. Jethro brings the other way, and so he listens. He lives it out. He lets the people go do it. He finds the right men. He releases them, delegates. He learns from that. But he did it all because he is a loving leader. A loving leader is first this. He is God-focused. The first thing about a loving leader is he is God-focused. Moses knew the place that God had put him in, that God had developed him for. We go all the way back to the burning bush and how Moses learned those lessons. But what he knew was God had placed him in this position at this time, at this place. And he loved God more than he loved himself. He wanted to do what God had called him to do. The second thing is that he was people-focused. He loved the people. And being people-focused, he desired to develop his people, to see them have their questions answered, to see them understand who God was. And the best way to do that was to be able to pass on that leadership. The third is, and perhaps the toughest, is that Moses was kingdom focused. What he recognized was that God's kingdom was more important than his own kingdom. This was about God's kingdom, the development of God's kingdom, not the development of Moses' kingdom. So when we get to that point and we understand a leader, that loving leader, who is God-focused, who is people-focused, and who is kingdom-focused, all of the rest of these characteristics, I tell you, will begin to fall into place. The world tells you, develop your own kingdom. A good spiritual leader, a proper leader, is interested in developing God's kingdom. So let me walk you through, now that we've talked through these five, the listening leader, the living leader, the liberating leader, the learning leader, and the loving leader. I want to show you what the application looks like. Simple application, and I'm going to give you one word. It's an acrostic, and it's the word show, S-H-O-W. Here's how I think you begin to apply those leadership characteristics to see the kind of leader you're going to be. The S in show stands for servant. If there's nothing more that separates a good leader, a biblical leader, from a leader in the world today, it's this. It is that he is a servant. We see this in the person of Jesus Christ over and over and over again. We see it in the upper room with Jesus, where he took the basin and the towel, wrapped it around himself, and washed the disciples' feet, and he said, this is what it's all about. So the first thing we understand in application is that we are to be a servant as leaders. We are to serve those around us. Very different from what the world tells us. The second thing, the H in show, is that we're to be humble. We're to show the humility that Christ showed. We're to show that humility that says it's not about me. I am God-focused. I am people-focused. I am kingdom-focused. That's where my perspective is. The third thing, the O, is that we're to be obedient. We saw it in Moses time and time again. He was obedient to what Jethro said to do, and he went and did it, understanding that that word came from God. And the fourth and final one, the W, is that we are willing. We're willing to lead where God tells us to lead. We're willing to lead how God shows us to lead. We're willing to put my kingdom aside for the purpose of developing God's kingdom. The word to use for how you apply this leadership is the word show. Servant, humble, obedient, and willing. Am I willing to show Christ through me as a leader? Well, I want to leave you with this quote from Pastor John Ruskin. John Ruskin said this, and then we'll leave it for some time for question and answer. John Ruskin said this. He said, I believe that the first test of a truly great leader is his humility. I do not mean by humility that he doubts his own power, but really great leaders have a curious feeling that the greatness is not in them, but through them. And they see something divine in others and are endlessly, foolishly, incredibly merciful and gracious. Remember, the five applications, the five characteristics of a leader: listening, living, liberating, learning, and loving. And the application of that is, how are you showing Christ as a servant, humble, obedient, and willing? The leadership principles, the leadership characteristics of Moses. Let me go to the chat room, see if there are questions. There's a lot of stuff being written here. A lot of stuff being written here. Let me ask you if there are any specific questions. If there are, unmute your mic. You can ask the questions directly. There's a number of statements being put up, a number of different things that are there. Thank you all for putting the chats in there. Any questions, any thoughts?
Hey, Mark, this is
Yeah.
Sam.
Hey, Sam.
Hey, one of the things that resonated with me, and I've been in this whole leadership business for a long, long time, but something that really resonated with me um, that you talked about was the loving leader. And that really resonated with me. And I've worked with a lot of leaders over 40 years, and it became very clear and very apparent to me when you brought up that principle that I tell you what, it's the loving leaders that have the most influence. They
Yep.
have the best following, and they uh, and people can tell when a leader loves them genuinely
Yeah.
or not. And that was really really telling. Is do they genuinely love the people that they are serving as a leader? That that's that's paramount. It's monumental.
Well, thanks, Sam. I appreciate that comment. What I can take you back to again, and I think the principle that Moses shows, number one, is that he was God focused first. Second, he was people focused. And third, he was kingdom focused. And when you look at it in that perspective, you can see how he loved the people. And the reason he loved the people is he knew God loved him. When he loved the people, he wanted to see the people infused into the kingdom work of God. That's their purpose. It's just, it all works together. It is one of the toughest things, I think, for a leader to do because they face a whole lot of stuff. And how does a leader actually show that love? But I think if you start with being God focused, people focused, and kingdom focused, what gets most of us as leaders tripped up is that we have a tendency to be me focused before anything else. And I agree with you that truly real love for the people that work with you and underneath you and above you. Because let's face it, a loving leader influences all around them. So great comment. Thank you, Sam. Any other questions, thoughts?
Yeah, I got one.
Hey, Carlen, how are you?
Yeah, great, great. Good to hear the message. Great message. Hey, I've got a question about, it's one that I just thought about as you were teaching. I was wondering, all that time that Moses spent in Egypt, have you ever thought about why he didn't have better delegation skills as a leader? All that time he spent, around the king and all of that. I mean, the way he was brought up, you would think he would know some basic leadership responsibilities such as delegation.
Well, I think you just answered your own question. One of the reasons why he didn't primarily was he was raised in Pharaoh's household. Pharaoh was a tyrant. Pharaoh was a dictator. I'm not sure he would have learned any really valuable leadership lessons that way. And of course, he leaves there early on. He doesn't stay in Pharaoh's household, and he's sent out into the wilderness for years and years and years where he's alone with God. I think a tremendous amount of his leadership lessons came as he recognized this one thing, which is part of that humility lesson. A huge part of that was he was placed in a situation where he went, you know what? I can't do this. And God said, don't worry, I'm going to give you Aaron. God said, don't worry, I'm going to give you a voice. God said, don't worry, I'm going to be with you. He recognized his own shortcomings of being able to pull this off. And I think we see Moses throughout the book of Exodus grow into this magnificent leader. But I think it's a great question. I'm not sure that the leadership principles that Pharaoh was showing are the leadership principles we wanted anybody to learn.
Yeah, because we'd have to do a study on Pharaoh's leadership principles, huh?
That's yes, sir.
Carlin, I
Absolutely.
think you've got a good question though, because good leaders create good leaders. Bad leaders create bad leaders.
Great point.
Moses obviously didn't have the best example, best model of leadership in the Pharaoh. Where did Jethro get his wisdom from?
That's a great question. In fact, I've got Valerie Reed in the chat who has said Jethro was very observant to realize that Moses was doing too much, and he was willing to share with him what he saw versus just letting him stumble. Jethro, who actually loved Moses, comes in and actually steps into that situation. Thank you, Valerie, for your comments in the chat room. And you're right. Bad leadership leads to bad leadership. Where did Jethro learn this? I'm not sure that we have an answer to that. Other than this, Jethro knows that he was sent by God to talk to Moses. He comes and he basically says, I'm here because God sent me here to have this conversation with you. So maybe it's just the wisdom of God coming through the mouthpiece of Jethro. That is basically, he said, I'm seeing it. You're doing it wrong. Let me show you how to do it right.
Yeah, that's probably a pretty good source then.
Yeah. Yeah. From God himself. Probably a pretty good source.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Great thoughts. Ooh, Paco just listed something. He says, seems like this current crisis is a huge test of leadership for organizations, businesses, churches, right? Absolutely. It is absolutely that. The crisis that we currently find ourselves in can be one of those things that God could be saying, are you going to follow me? You're going to follow the world. True leaders that rise to the surface, who care about their people, who care about what God has to say, who care about his kingdom, not their own. This is where that leadership is, that cream of leadership is going to rise to the surface, I think. Great comment, Paco. Thank you. Other questions, thoughts? A lot of people on, but a lot of people quiet there. So let me do this. And thank you to Shamika. She's put a number of things in the chat about the things that I've talked about. I've got a series of notes that goes along with this that I can actually post at a later time. And we can put it up on the Grace Cafe, on the Grace app, and bring that kind of stuff along to bear. So if any of the other speakers have that kind of stuff, we can also get those things posted up there as well. I want to thank you for spending a little bit of time with me on the person of Moses. Let me ask you if you want to, does anybody, put it in the chat if you do, does anybody need about a 5-minute break before we bring on Carlen and let him bring us the leadership principles of Joseph? Are you ready to just launch ahead? Let me know what you think. Well, it's awfully quiet out there, so let's launch ahead. I'm going to introduce my good friend, Carlen Charleston. Carlen and I got to know each other about a year ago. He is the founder and head of Erase Race. He has been in the military. He has been in a number of different businesses. He has led people over and over again and is now leading a national movement to erase race. He's a good friend of mine, passionate. You're going to love his enthusiasm and his excitement. Listen to his message on the Grace app at the Biblical Conference. It's a marvelous message on leadership. When I was talking to him about doing this, he was thrilled to be given the opportunity to bring what he loves about the person of Joseph. So I'm going to introduce Carlen Charleston and let you take it away. Carlen, thanks for being a part of this. It's all yours, brother.
Okay, I guess I'm here. Hopefully, I'm doing everything right and my sound's okay and everybody can hear me. So got all the technical difficulties out of the way. You know, as one of these things has been happening since everybody's kind of been live streaming, I was watching. I think it wasn't Charles Stanley. Who was it? I think it was our John Maxwell. I'm part of the John Maxwell team, and I was watching them trying to do a live streaming, and they were having technical difficulties. And I said, "Hey, even big time people have technical difficulties. It's not just the small guys." So that was fine. And so this is great, and I'm glad to be here today. And I am really excited to talk about Joseph. I tell you what, you know, there's a lot of things I can talk about. I talk a lot about football, you know, and I'm the guy who one day I say when I get 80 years old, I'm going to be a football coach one day. And so I'm waiting on that time to come. And so I'll be a football coach. I love talking about sports. I love talking about fitness, and I love talking about leadership, and specifically godly leadership. Just as way of my background, of course, I did do the Marine Corps thing. I was a Marine Corps officer, retired as Lieutenant Colonel, was there for 20 years, and then I had the ultimate leadership challenge when I began teaching high school. you want a leadership challenge? You teach high school and you'll get a challenge. And so I did that for 12 years, exciting 12 years. And during that time, of course, that's when I got two advanced degrees, both in leadership, one from Regent University and one from Western International University, one in a topic called innovative leadership, which was really cool. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And then the other one in not-for-profit leadership. So I think I have some leadership background, but you know what I found out? The more leadership information and knowledge I get, the more I realize how little I have. And so I would hate to call myself an expert. That's one of the things as this coronavirus case has been going on. I've been saying, hey, let's listen to the experts. And they got no answers. So expert doesn't mean that much these days. So expert doesn't mean anything. So I just say that I've had a lot of courses in leadership. I've experienced a lot in leadership, and so I try to talk about some of the leadership experiences I've had, and I don't throw that term around like as a leadership expert or anything like that. But I am excited about really talking about Joseph. I think Joseph's one of my favorite Bible stories, if not my favorite. I say of mere mortals. Of course, I don't include the gospel itself about Jesus Christ. Let's talk about the mortal people, the people, Jesus Christ is in a different realm because of such a good story, but the story of Joseph is just great. If you're going to teach leadership, you got to teach the story of Joseph because you got to teach the story about being downtrodden, overcoming the odds. We call them Horatio Alger stories. This story of rags to riches, this guy who was nothing and became great. And that's the ultimate story of Joseph. And so I've got a few things that we'll talk about along those lines. And hopefully you'll be as excited as I am when I'm done. Otherwise, I'll have done a poor job, and so you'll say, hey, that wasn't, all right? But let's talk about some, just the basic topic of leadership. I heard Mark giving some definitions, and I don't have definitions, but I do have this one great quote that comes from John Maxwell. And he said, a leader is one who knows the way, shows the way, and goes the way. And I think that kind of sums up really what we think about when we think about leadership, and really as we talk about, I'm going to talk to you about the leadership of Joseph. I call it the Joseph Project because every time I think of Joseph, I think of it as a project. And I say we're all going through a Joseph project because God is trying to do this transforming thing in all of our lives to make us come from this beginning place, which is what Joseph did, from this small little place to the palace, and that road from what most people refer to as the pit to the palace is one that I think God is trying to do with all of us. Because if nothing else, it's the spiritual growth that we have as we begin as immature babes in Christ until that point where we depart the planet until God's finished conforming us to the image of his son. That's what I call the Joseph Project, where he's transforming, doing these great things in our lives. And of course, you could do that with almost any of the patriarchs or any of the stories of great people that God used in the Bible. He's got a project underway, and he's got a project underway for you and me. And so we're going to talk about the Joseph Project and what God was really doing in the life of Joseph and how Joseph understood that very early. And even that Bible dynamic, when you think about leadership, the Bible is written in a way so that you understand that there's this dynamic of leader, follower, and we understand that all authority is given by God. That's what the scripture says. And so did God then, in fact, perhaps create this leader-follower dynamic for us to understand this deeper concept of obedience? Because think about it, in the patriarchs, they just had this guy like Moses. Moses would go and talk to God, and he would come and tell the people. Okay, and then the people, would choose to obey or do whatever Moses said. And so I think that whole concept of the leader-follower is built in us having an understanding of this relationship of obedience. So you can't kind of separate those things out. Even though I'm not really talking about strictly obedience today, I do want us to understand that leaders and leadership is put in place because there will be followers. And you would think of followers as those who would be obedient to the leadership, or at least submissive to the leadership of the leader. And so we've got to understand that. And then in this context, you've got to understand that not only are leaders put in that position to lead, but leaders then must also be obedient. So who are the leaders obedient to? The person who has called them to lead. And so if you understand then that God creates all he puts all leaders in authority, then it is those leaders who understand that they were put there by God who then can live out God's purpose in their leadership. Because a lot of people don't understand that you were put there by God, and they use that position of leadership for their own interests. And so that's sad. And that's why ultimately we have a breakdown of what we call good leaders and bad leaders. And that's often why we as believers sometimes want to follow those, or just I'd say the human nature is for us to follow leaders we like. And we really shouldn't follow leaders we like. We should follow leaders who are submitted to the ultimate authority and following his call. And that's what makes it easy for us to submit. But in either case, as believers, we have the requirement for submission to those who are in authority. And of course, we know as long as it doesn't conflict with God's ultimate authority. So that whole dynamic's in play, and those are just things I'm throwing out there because I've come to talk to you about Joseph, and I got these 5 points. I go ahead and cover those 5 points, and then we'll open up in it. So while I'm talking and you want to go to scripture, we're going to go from Genesis 37 to about 45, and at least that's my plan, and I'll see if we get there. But that's the area we're covering. The great story, chapter 38 is really not, it's one we'll skip through, but most of all the other chapters have some great things that we'll talk about as we cover the story of the leadership of Joseph. All right, so let me give you my 5 points that we're going to cover, and then you'll see if I can fill them out as we go through the scripture. Point number 1 is leaders have their quirks, and they can also be called gifts, but leaders have their quirks, and we're going to see what the quirk was for Joseph and how that's often a person's gift, because it's that thing that society rejects, but it's a thing that God's given you. Number 2, leaders will have haters, all right? Because leaders have quirks, then they're going to face a lot of opposition, and that's for a number of reasons. So we'll look at that. That'll be number 2. And number 3, leaders have God with them, and therefore they serve. And so that servant leadership thing that Mark was referring to, we're going to talk about that and why, and that whole relationship of why leaders do serve and how they're able to serve. And I think it has a lot to do with they understand God has them in that position, just as we talked about earlier. Number 4, we're going to talk about how leaders see leadership opportunities in every circumstance or situation. Leaders see leadership opportunities in every circumstance or situation. That's why they're leaders, because they see things that other people don't see. They see bad things as, wow, great opportunity. They see good things as great opportunities. So we'll talk about that. And we'll finish up with, because all that other stuff that we just talked about, because we'll talk about how leaders find their purpose and opportunity in all circumstances. Because of all that, they're patient with the process. So leaders are patient with the process. God's up to something. He's doing something. And when we are patient and waiting on him, then we can see it through to fruition. Okay? Because God's doing something. It's not us. God is doing something, and we're able. All right? So let's start out with the beginning. All right? So if you go to Genesis 37, which is where we start, and we find out in 37 that Joseph was this guy who was a dreamer. And because he was a dreamer, of course, he was hated. He was hated by his brothers. And we won't talk about the parenting of Jacob, but Jacob had a favorite. And he did certain things. And those things that he did for his son that was his favorite, Joseph, made his brothers hate him even more. All right? But then the big thing that they did, though, they hated him. Why? More than anything, they hated him, not just because he was a favorite, but because he had this special quirk. He had this thing. He was a dreamer. And they referred to him oftentimes when they wanted to demean him. They said, hey, dreamer boy, hey, dreamer. And because he was a dreamer, they really hated him. So on this particular occasion there in Genesis 37, then he has to go out and, he brings back these negative reports to his dad. I hate to say it, but he's kind of like the snitch, which is maybe why his dad likes him, because he's the guy who check on your brothers, and he comes back and he's honors his dad and goes, they're terrible. I mean, they're terrible. They're over there lazy. They're not doing the things they're supposed to do, whatever. And so on this one occasion, when they see him coming out to get the report, they're like, hey, here comes the dreamer. Here comes the dreamer. Hey, and they have this terrible plan, of course, to get rid of him. However, the older brother steps in as the leader and says, guys, come on. I mean, he's our brother. You can't kill the guy. What are you thinking about? We can't kill him. So instead they do something and they say, hey, let's profit off of him, hey, let's throw him in the pit. And so they throw him in the pit and go, hey, here come these Ishmaelites. Hey, let's sell this guy into slavery. All right. So now, and leading up to that point, they had gotten so upset with Joseph because Joseph had told them about one of his dreams. And in his dream, then everybody else bowed down to him. And man, that really ticked them off. So they're really upset. But here's the thing about why leaders have their quirks, which I call gifts. Joseph's quirk was, of course, his dreaming. And what you're going to find as I go through this, and what you'll find as you read through that Genesis passage all the way up to 37 to 45, you'll find that that quirk that Joseph had was the thing that God gave him and was going to be the thing that propelled him or that raised him up, exalted him in everything that he did. That one quirk, that gift, that thing that the rest of the world, his brothers and others might have said, yeah, they demeaned him for it. And so think about your gifts and think about what you have. The thing that people might be demeaning you for, this thing that you use, that could be this gift that you have, that you're just not like everybody else, because that's the thing that set Joseph apart. He wasn't like the rest of them. You know, he was just different. And this was one of the things he was different in. He was going around telling people about these dreams, and they hated him more. He was favored by his father, and they hated him more. So he had these strange quirks, but those quirks were the things that God was going to use him to exalt him, okay? So the word would be embrace your quirks. Embrace your quirks, because that could be the thing that came from God that's going to propel you up. And so, but he was more than just the dreamer, you know. And that's the other thing about him as we think about his quirks. I remember there's a poem by Rudyard Kipling called "If," and this is what he subscribed to. Rudyard Kipling saying, "If you can dream and not make dreams your master," and that's the thing about Joseph. Joseph had the dream, and I think the dream was inspiring. But Joseph was beyond the dream. He was willing to go through what's necessary to see fulfillment of that dream as we go through the story, and you'll see that, you know, because a dream is a dream until you wake up and do something about it. So that's what he had to do. All right. So that's kind of what takes place in Genesis 37. All right. And so we find out then after all those things happen that you'll see this theme in number 2. Let's go to number 2, where leaders have haters. Leaders face opposition. They have these haters at every level. So this might be the first scriptural account where you find out that someone hates Joseph. What that introduces you to is a lifetime up until he becomes second in charge in Egypt. Does he have people who hate him for various reasons? Okay? And so what really is going on when you have haters, when you have detractors, when you have people against you, God is training you for the opposition that you're going to face at every level, even as he exalts you and raises you to that position or that status where he's taking you. So understand that. And so when you understand that, you have a very different attitude towards what I call your haters. People that come against you or people that are opposed to you. You have a very different view of that. So understand that leadership really is the call for us to move in spite of that opposition. Leaders do that. They continue to move in the face of resistance. And so that's very important. I think about the things that cause us to be able to do that. And I think it goes back to that first thing where he had this quirk. Okay, he had this quirk and he was rejected for that quirk. So that meant, you know, and this is one of the things I think as I taught high school, I told kids about, you know, how you need to grow thicker skin and understand people will say things, you know, how they used to say, sticks and stones may break your bones, words can never hurt you. They really can. However, we have a responsibility to understand that we're greater than those words that some people utter towards us in opposition. We're greater than that, and we need to understand that. And you can only understand that when you understand, when you go back and say, well, God's given me this. When you know that God's equipped you for those things, then you're able to handle them, because we don't know how we really get past that. But I think about when I was a kid, I was a short kid, and of course I'm still short today. I never grew tall, even though I did have a friend in high school who was in my short club. When we had our 40-year reunion after high school, the guy was 6'4". I'm like, wait, we graduated high school. You were short like me. We were both 5'5", 5'6", and he just said, yeah, I had this strange growth spurt after high school. And so, but one of the things we did in our short guys club. You know, I had a friend named Audie Alcorn. He was short with me. We were short crew. And so that thing then gave us a reason to bond. And because we bonded as short people, then we began to have to, we weren't accepted by the crowd. And because we weren't accepted by the crowd and we weren't popular, we didn't go the way they went. So what did that mean for us? You know, Audie graduated number 3 in the class. I graduated number 6 because we had to find something else that was positive for us because we weren't part of the in crowd. So we basically did better than the in crowd because we had to find something else. And so that's what I think happens with those quirks. And when you face opposition, when you face haters, then you realize that your gifts and things have set you apart. And it sets you apart usually because God has leadership. He has an example he wants to make of you by being set apart. That's what he does with us as believers. We are, in fact, set apart. And as being set apart, then we can become an example. We can become a light. We can become something that people will see and look up to as different. And so those quirks can be different. They can cause opposition, but can all be a very good thing. So think about that, how leaders can move forward in spite of that. Bottom line is that leaders know that, and they always do that. They keep moving in spite of that. And I think the reason that they can do that is point number 3 that we can learn from the life of Joseph is that good leaders know they have God with them, and therefore they serve. Boy, when you start looking at the passage, and we get to Genesis 39. You look at Genesis 39, and the first time it cites it, it says in verse 2 there, it says, and the Lord was with Joseph. And he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So a quick point about that. Think about that. You know that God is with you, and that's very important for leaders. If you know that God has put you there for his purposes and that God is with you, then it does 2 things. It makes you a very good example where you are, and it comforts you in trial. Okay? Because that is the only way sometimes when you face some of the things that you're going to face in life that you can keep going is number one, that it came from God. Because I don't think some of this stuff, if Joseph hadn't known, now at the end of the story, and I'm going to tell you the ending right now because you probably know the ending of the story, but that ultimate line that Joseph said at the end was that his brothers did this bad thing to him. You meant it for bad, but God meant it for good. That's what we need to be able to say about everything that takes place in our life. That when people come against us and we have this opposition and all these things are happening, we need to be able to say at that point and understand at that point that people mean this thing for bad, but God is with us. And so that's very big. That's point number 3. Leaders understand that God is with them. The other thing that does is, and if you go ahead, if we read further through that 39 verse 2, and then we get to verse 3, it says, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. All right? So that example that you set, people see that. People know that. When they see, wow, there's something about this person, I don't know what it is, because think about it. There's nothing in the scripture that tells us that these Egyptians, knew God. They didn't. These are pagans who don't know God, but hey, what? They knew that this God was with them. They knew that when Joseph said something, when Joseph did something, it was prosperous. And so what did they do? Then it says in verse 4, and Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer of his house and all that he had put into his hand. That's verse 4. Look at that. See how this works? It's a reciprocal process. You understand that God put you in that position for his purpose. Because God put you in that position for his purpose, you therefore serve as unto the Lord. And so you give your all. You use all of your abilities in honoring God because he put you there. Mankind, whether evil leaders, good leaders, any kind of leaders in charge, see that you are prosperous for their business, for their livelihood, and that you have something special to offer because they might not know, they might think it's just your skill and your ability. But the reality is, it is the fact that God is with you and everything that you put your hand to prospers. Then as a result of that, you find grace in their sight. then they then begin to lift you, give you more responsibilities, and you have found favor with not only God, but as the scripture says in Luke 2:52, with God and man. So that's the way it works. And so sometimes in our society today, people are waiting on others to do, well, they're not doing right by me, so I'm not going to do this. They're cheating on their jobs because they don't feel like their boss is giving them enough or whatever. And so that doesn't start that cycle that happens right here, because in this cycle, it's I understand God put me here. This job that I have, I need to be doing as unto the Lord. Because I'm doing it as unto the Lord, then I'm serving wholeheartedly. My boss, my master sees it. I find favor in his sight. He gives me more responsibility, opportunities, bigger paycheck, bigger responsibilities, and that whole cycle begins to start. But it doesn't start when the person says, well, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to cheat them. I'm not going to work because they're not paying me enough. It doesn't work that way. So we need to understand that practically, and that's a very good lesson out of Joseph here, that when we understand that God is with us, it really does make us serve. So that's one of the things Joseph understood, and so he was able to serve that way. And you see what happens in the story of Joseph. All right, so that's the way that relationship works. All right, and I like it at the point where it says, "And it came to pass." We're in verse 5 now. It says, "And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored." Now this sounds great. This is and so for the Christian viewpoint, you would say, hey, everything worked out. Everything worked out. This is great. But the thing is, God is not finished with any of us when we reach the top of the mountain. In God's economy, there is no top of the mountain. You know, in God's economy, it's all about all these circumstances are opportunities for him to continue to work us and conform us to his image. And so Joseph didn't get here, and Joseph realized, I'm here now, and now I've reached the pinnacle, and everything is great, and I can stop here, because he knew that he was still had this responsibility to serve God. So, but at this point, it looks like everything is great. But the story goes on, because as we go to the next thing that happens at the end of that chapter, we see that Joseph has the run-in with Potiphar's wife. Okay, all right. So we're now go up to our fourth point, and here's the deal, because he's had this great life, and everything was going great, and then he's at Potiphar's, and Potiphar sees that his house is blessed because of him. And then this thing happens, and he's got this unfounded rape accusation that gets him thrown into prison. So we're at leadership point number 4 today, and that point is this. So now that he's getting thrown into prison because of the false accusations of rape of Potiphar's wife, leaders do this. Leaders see leadership opportunities in every circumstance. Leaders see leadership opportunities in everything they do. In every circumstance they find themselves in, they see it as a leadership opportunity. So that's the story of what happened with Joseph when he gets to Potiphar's and he gets this unfounded rape accusation. He gets thrown into prison, and all of that favor and status that he achieved at Potiphar's seemed to be gone. In the twinkling of an eye, it's gone. You know, hey, I thought you had me doing this thing. You know, he didn't get rejected and say, you know, God, you had me on the path. How could this happen to me? Why am I here in prison now? So the key is that leaders don't just lead when they are what seems like lofty positions of leadership. Leaders lead in everything they do because leadership is a part of their being. So it really didn't matter to Joseph. You know, he was in that pit. Then he came, of course, to Potiphar's and got all this responsibility. Now he's in prison. And so guess what's going to happen when he's in prison? If you're a leader, your situation or circumstance doesn't determine whether or not you can lead. Leading is what you do, all right? Because God has given you that mantle of leadership, and you're exercising that mantle of leadership because God has given it to you. So Joseph is cast into prison, and of course his leadership skills kick in. So we're at verse 20 there, and it says, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. All right, so it makes it clear he's there in the prison. Once again, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. I want to say that last line again. It says, whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. This is the responsibility of leadership. In high school, and I would teach character education, and I had my students, my cadets, broken down into leadership ranks, and so I had a person who was in charge, kind of the Jethro thing. One person was in charge of the whole battalion, another person was in charge of the platoon, another person was in charge of the squad. So we had the Jethro message happening there. But the key thing about it was that I told each of them at their levels of responsibility, you are responsible for everything that your people do or fail to do. That's the mantle of leadership. And that's what Joseph understands very early in life. He understood it when he was at Potiphar's, and he understands it here. He's in the prison, and it says they committed all the prisoners that were in the prison to him. And whatsoever the prisoners did, then it says Joseph was the doer of it. Why? Because Joseph had the ultimate responsibility, because he had the mantle of leadership. And so we need to understand that. So when you find leadership, and here's a big one, when you find leadership, and there's, as Mark was saying, as I've heard John Maxwell say, I've heard so many people talk about the dearth of authentic leadership. Matter of fact, I've got a book that's titled So Many Leaders, So Little Leadership. And that's so true. We got a lot of leaders out there, but we don't have a lot of leadership happening. Because when you find a leader who takes responsibility and says, the buck stops here, then you found a leader. But when you find a leader who says, it's not my fault and I'm blaming, or I want to decide who to blame, then by definition, they're not taking on that responsibility of leadership, and therefore they are not leaders. All right? So very key that they identify that, they put him in prison, and everything that the prisoners do now, they account to Joseph. So if the prisoners are doing well, if they're doing great things, Joseph's got that. If they're doing bad things, Joseph's got that. So in your positions of leadership today, wherever you are responsible for the good and bad. You are ultimately responsible. And I've seen a lot of leaders. I've seen this. And I think the Marine Corps creates great leadership, but even in that environment, I've seen people who would sell others out to clear themselves. That's not leadership. When you put yourself first, leadership says that people come first. That was that loving leader that Mark talked about before. The loving leader understands that my people, that I rise or fall based on my people. So I invest in my people. I invest in the relationship with my people. I invest in the development of my people, because my people, I am responsible for everything they do or fail to do. All right. And so in verse 23, it says, and the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. That is the great testimony for a believer, for someone who's submitted to God. When your boss says, I don't have to check up on Carlen because everything that he does, God is with him. I wish that was my testimony for some of my bosses, that they didn't have to check up on me because they knew that all I did was good. Why? Because, this was a strange thing I did when I was in the Marine Corps, that I had this idea, and perhaps it's so that God could have me use that in this lesson today. But, Marines and all branches of the military, they have these ribbons that they wear on their uniforms, these medals that they get for doing things and all this, whatever. Well, very early in my career, I had this in my mind, and I said this to my bosses. Every time they would want to write me up for a medal and an award, I would say, sir, anything that I did, it was my responsibility to do. I'm an officer in the United States Marine Corps. I do not need an award. And that was, I never really had to really say that loudly until I became a major. So I made it all the way up to the rank. If you know the rank structure, I was a second lieutenant, first lieutenant, captain, and that had worked pretty much all the way through my career. And it was great because, I just said, I used to tell everybody, I said, I'm going to be a first colonel in the Marine Corps that has no personal awards. I don't believe in personal awards. It's all about us, the team. And I got to major, and this one of my bosses said, "You're going to take this award I'm giving you, or I'm writing you up for something else." And which meant he was going to give me some negative documentation. And I didn't want to be, that. I said, "Okay, sir, okay." And so I ended up taking the award, and I was like, "All right, well, I kind of ruined my whole thing now. So, well, any award you give me, and so people used to laugh and go, "You're a colonel. How do you have hardly no ribbons, whatever?" And didn't want to tell them the story. I didn't want to tell them that I just believed that anything I did was my responsibility to do. And so this is the thing that Joseph had. Joseph felt like it doesn't matter, this is what I do. And so whether he was in the prison, it doesn't matter where he was, then he knew that God was with him. He knew that he would prosper. People used to tell me this mustache that I have. When I got in the Marine Corps, they just said, "No, we don't have officers with mustaches. You're going to have to cut that." And I was like, I don't want to cut my mustache. It's when we're authorized to have them, and it's just like when God is with you, you can break all the norms when God is with you, because if God's got a destination for you, an appointment for you, stick with that. And you really don't have to worry about convention when you know that God is with you. You've got to only be responsible for hearing God's voice and obeying Him. And as Charles Stanley says, hear God, obey Him, and leave all the consequences to Him. That's the part where people begin to kind of adjust, because they're not willing to leave the consequences to Him, because it doesn't mean it works out. Everything in my life hasn't worked out, but hey, But I'll tell you what, it works out for God's purpose. And that's all I'm concerned about, and that's all we as believers should be concerned about, that it works out for His purpose, not necessarily ours. And so that's good, and we can be comfortable in that. And I think Joseph was, all right? All right, so and so you see that grace. You see verse 22. Yeah, that's great. Whatever they did, he was a doer of it. That's great. Where it began. I think about this too. One of the last things before I get to my final point. When you think about this leadership, because those are things that happened in the Marine Corps, but I began to ask myself, when did I really get this penchant for leadership? When did I desire it? Was it when I was in the Marine Corps? And as I began looking back over my life, I started seeing these things. And I think this would have been very true of Joseph too. When he got to Egypt and was second in charge, he could look back at his life and see how all those things worked in the providence of God. And it's very easy for us to see providence looking back behind us when we look at our lives. When I was 13, 14, 15, 23, 43, 53, 63, we can make more sense. But today, the challenge is for us as believers to take that step of faith and believe in what God is telling us to do now, so that we can look back and see that providence, because that's what you want to do looking back, see the providence of God. Going forward, you've got to exercise faith and believe, because Joseph didn't know when he was in prison that, man, I'm going to be second in Egypt one day. He didn't know that. He had to believe that if he was simply obedient, and that if he heard God and followed God, then he would go where God had destined for him. And that's our challenge, and that's what we need to do. All right? One of the things as I look back, and this is just one story of many that I could tell, and I don't want to take a lot of time because I want to get a lot of questions. I want to get some questions. But I think when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, so we lived in a small, probably 1,500 square foot house. There were 8 of us, you got one bathroom, whatever. 6 kids, and so, and reality is we don't think we were poor. I still, even to this day, don't think we were poor. We had everything we needed. I never missed a meal or whatever. It was great. But there were, with 4 boys and 2 girls, so 4 boys in a bedroom, 2 girls in another bedroom, and mom and dad in their room, whatever. But it was this cool thing. My oldest brother was he's 6 years older than me. And then behind me are my brothers. We were all a year apart. So if I was 8, one was 7, one was 6. So when my oldest brother, they eventually converted the garage and kicked him out of the room. So he had his garage. He slept out there. But the 3 of us were in this room. And so I think about where my leadership began. When we were that age, that young age, and we thought that house was, I guess, huge in our minds because we're little kids. At nighttime, though, if one of my brothers, one of my younger brothers, I was the oldest of those 3, if they had to get up wanted to use the restroom, they would wake me up as the leader and say, "I've got to go." And so if they had to go, then we wouldn't turn on any lights. And so I would say, "Everybody grab this hand," and I would lead them through the darkness into the restroom. We'd all use the restroom, and then I would say, "All right, grab his hand." I would lead them back to the bedroom. We're back in bed, and we're safe. God develops leadership way before we think he's developing. It wasn't when I was in the Marine Corps just that I developed leadership. God's doing things way ahead of us. And we've got to understand that. And we can see that as we look back when we see the providence of God in our lives. So that's something to think about. All right, so let's get to point number 5 then. Because I did, besides all that, you got all this stuff. I was high school captain of the football team, then I did the Marine Corps. I had a barbecue business. I created this nonprofit organization. All that's good leadership stuff, but all that stuff that I see now that God has equipped me to do, then I do. But God started, here's the thing I kept telling everybody after I toured the country last year. I said, this might be a surprise to you. This might be a surprise to a lot of people, but guess what? God is way ahead of us. He's way ahead of us. He's always way ahead of us. And we think, that we're doing something new and like, wow, guess what I just found out? Yeah, God was way ahead of me. All right. So number 5, because leaders find purpose and opportunity in all circumstances, then they are, in fact, they're patient with the process. They're able to, as Isaiah said, wait on the Lord. They that wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They're able to wait on God because they understand the process. God is with them. They understand what God is doing. And so for believers, that's what we understand when it comes to leadership. You find out that God's got purpose and why he put you in that position of leadership. You see that there's so much opportunity in where he's placed you. You've got opportunities for ministry to people, the testimony that you have before them, the example that you set for them. All those things are part of God's plan for you. And because you see all that stuff happening, then you can be patient to where God is taking you, because who knows whether or not God does not have you to be second in command in Egypt. And figuratively speaking, that could mean you are on your way to being president, vice president of a company, of the country, the governor of your state. All those, of course, are what we call secular positions, but no position is secular when God puts you there. When God puts you there for his purposes, it's not secular. It's now entering into the realm of spiritual and faith, because you are a faith person doing that thing that God has called you to do. And so good leaders really know that it takes time for this conforming process. Romans 8:29 says that we're being conformed to the image of his son. God's leaders, people who understand that God put them there, they know that it takes time for that process to happen, where he's molding us, he's shaping us, he's making us, and so they're patient. So if you put me in prison today, that's fine, because I'm being shaped and I'm being molded. If you give me a 6-figure salary and I'm wealthy as all get out, I'm fine, because God is still making me or molding me. It is not those situations or circumstances that are the highlight of our lives. It's the fact that I am in the will of God and doing that thing that God has called me to do. So good leaders, real leaders, are able to wait on God. When we get in chapter 40, when Joseph lands there in prison, he's got his gifts, he's got his quirks, and those things are still with him. But in chapter 40, then, that's where he gets in the prison with the butler and the baker. And is that coincidence? No. But guess what happens? The butler and the baker have dreams. Well, guess what Joseph's quirk is? Yeah, dreams. Wow. So God's got something working there. So, they had their dreams. You know the story. They had their dreams. Joseph, of course, interprets their dreams. And then, here's the kicker. Once again, Joseph is thinking, wow. I mean, this would be Carlen's version of Joseph at this point. Oh, wow. This worked out perfectly. God, I'm able to use my gift. Now get me out of this prison, God, But here's the deal. Joseph actually tells the butler, when you get back to Pharaoh's court and you're restored, drop Pharaoh a word about me. And of course, as soon as the butler gets back, he forgets. All right, he forgets about Joseph. Hey, butler, I'm free. I'm back in the palace with the king. So yeah, let me live my life. And that goes on. And what's Joseph doing? He's down there just waiting. And what do you think he's probably doing? I guarantee you he's doing a stellar job. He's in charge of those prisoners. He's governing them just like it's the greatest thing. He's working as unto the Lord. And he's probably still getting favor from the prison guards. And they're probably giving him special privileges, giving him a weekend pass. All right, I'm making all that stuff up. But I guarantee you he's getting the favor of those people down there, because he understands that God is still with him. He understands that. And but then this crazy thing happens in that passage. When you get to chapter 41, and this great thing happens, so they get back there, and this guy's forgotten. Now time has passed, and it's almost like 2 years. And that's the other thing. When you look at the timeline of this whole thing, so when they put him in the pit, when his brothers put him in the pit, he was 17. The scripture says he was 17. The time when he actually got, and we're not even there yet in the story as I'm telling you, when he becomes second in Egypt, he's 30 years old. All right, he's 30 years old. So he spent that time at Potiphar's in the prison. So he spent we're talking about 13 years, so that he spent, in some state of ups and downs, but in the meantime, having to just do God's business however he thinks God wants him to do it. And so that's amazing, because then, remember, when he got to the palace, though, because this is actually my last point, when he got to the palace and was second in charge, he understood it still wasn't done. I haven't reached my pinnacle yet. God is still doing things. And not just the fact that he was going to restore Joseph's family to him in Egypt, but he understands that he's still undergoing transformation. It's a very heart-rending rendition of the story when Joseph's brothers come there and he recognizes them and things like that. You really feel that in Genesis 45, because when you get to Genesis 45, when they come in and his brothers are really scared, when they find out, he goes, "Oh, by the way, guys, I'm Joseph. You don't know who I am. I'm Joseph." Because, and I won't spend the time, but he played a lot of tricks with them before he let them know. He played some tricks with them, being very harsh with them, saying, "Hey, you guys are coming here to spy on us," whatever, because he knew who they were and he wanted to get more information. And of course, he sends them back home, and they tell their dad Jacob how harsh he was, the ruler there was to them, how harsh he was with them, and that he wants them to not come back unless they bring their younger brother Benjamin. And their dad says, "No, that can't happen. That can't happen." And first of all, here's a side note on Jacob too. You remember Jacob's name? Jacob means deceiver. And while Jacob at this point is later on in his life, and he'd wrestled with God or whatever, and he became Israel and all that stuff, he's at this point. One of the things when they went back and said, the guy said for us not to come back unless we bring Benjamin, our youngest brother. Jacob's got a little of that deceiver. He goes, "Hey, why did you tell him this?" And the brother said, "Well, because he asked, and we weren't going to lie, and you get the feeling that Jacob is like saying, "Well, you could have lied, and said you don't have another brother." So Jacob, so that's what, as people of God, we're in this flesh body, and we have to remain submitted to God every day to continue to live in that, because we all can probably remember the person that we were and how we can always go back there if we wanted to, but our desire is to continue to please God. But that's so Genesis 45 now, then Joseph gives this great diatribe, I'd say, about, in 45, 5 through 8, it says, "Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life." He's got the insight of what God was doing. "For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." That's a guy who understands through adversity, through whatever situation you're in life, it's about what God is doing with me. These situations and circumstances that befall me have nothing to do with anything except God's great purpose that he has for my life. And that's the challenge for us as believers. And so whether we're in a pit at 17 or in the palace at 70, leaders are always successful when they know the truth that God is with them and walk in that knowledge. Okay? All right, so that's kind of it, and I kind of hit the high points, and I'd love to take some questions. I love answering the questions. Just like I said, I love this story. It's a great story, and I usually can transition almost anything that happens in the story of Joseph, not only to something that happened in my life, but things that I see in leadership in general, because I think this is the ultimate case of leadership. And Joseph is one of the few people in the scripture where you really don't find, as far as his leadership, any negatives about something that he did. I mean, everybody else has got these stories of, Abraham, well, he went and he had to lie to the king to do this thing or whatever. He did some things. Jacob was kind of tricky and deceptive with his brother Esau and whatever. He did some things. Joseph is a guy who, from the start, was just seemed like always on the up and up and doing the thing that God had him to do. So that's my analysis. But hey, let's talk about it. I'll take some questions. Anybody got any questions? And I'll take those. And then there were the crickets.
Hey, Carlen.
Yes, sir.
Hey, this is Sam. Hey,
Okay.
one of the questions that I've got that I've been wrestling with, I guess, for a while, and I'm actually going to be talking about it next on Thursday night when I give my talk, is Romans 13:1, and you touched on it several times, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it. Romans 13:1 says, Paul says, "Let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." I'm going to be talking about the relationship between King Saul and David on Thursday night. And David recognized king's anointed position by God, and he respected that. Paul goes on to tell us and to instruct. He instructs Titus in Titus 3:1. Says, "Remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work." The question I have that I've been wrestling with, I'm not sure I've got a real clear understanding of it. Maybe you can shed some light on it. If God puts all leaders in place, and we know there are good ones and we know there are bad ones, does that mean God puts bad leaders in place? And if so, why?
Oh, yeah. Very, very, very good question. And I think, remember, the ultimate objective for God is, of course, our conformity to the image of his son, Christ. All right. So if that is true, then, and you look at the cross that Christ had to bear and the places where Christ was, Christ demonstrated his submission even to wicked rulers. But however, when he got there before Pilate, then Pilate talked about his power. But Christ made clear to him, even in that exchange, that you would have no power unless my Father gave it to you. Nevertheless, though, Christ submitted himself to Pilate. And so I think the ultimate objective is, regardless of whether it is a good leader or a bad leader, a godly leader or a wicked leader, we have that responsibility. And then, of course, in that Acts, I think, 4th chapter, where Peter and them eventually had to say whether it is better that we obey God rather than men. There will be those times, and I think that's the same thing as the story of Daniel. There'll be those times. Daniel was very submissive to Nebuchadnezzar, the wicked ruler. However, there will be those times when you begin to violate my faith relationship with the God that I serve, that's the time when I will choose to violate your earthly authority. So there's a designated time when that is appropriate, but by and large, we are to submit. God is teaching us that lesson of obedience and submission, sometimes even to wicked rulers when it is not in violation of God's commands or decrees. And so that's what we got to, I think, understand.
Interesting. Very, very good. Thank you very much for that clarity.
Hey, Carlen, it's Mark. Question came up in the chat room, and it's a good question. In view of the weighty responsibilities, how common is leadership fatigue, and what effective strategies can one follow in order to avoid this? Leaders tend to think of serving others, yet sometimes fail to take care of themselves. Just talk for a brief moment about leadership fatigue.
Oh, yeah, great question. And two points I want to make about leadership fatigue. And I took a course called Trauma Informed Care, and they talked about this concept of self-care, which I think pastors do that. Pastors understand that. self-care, you do have to do that. It's kind of like when you're on the airplane and they tell you, put your mask on. You know, you got to put yours on before you can put on your child. Yeah, you got to make sure you're breathing clearly before you can get others breathing clearly. So there's this self-care thing. But the other thing about that is understanding the source of our energy and our strength. And that is the key for Joseph, knowing and understanding God is with you and operating where God has you operating. And because remember, those that wait on the Lord, what happens? He will do what? Renew their strength. You know, and that's what's key. We can be really renewed. God has a plan for our renewal when we are operating in his purpose and his plan. He really does. And so it doesn't mean that we keep working, but it's God will give us those times of rest. He will work those things in, and we can see them when we're operating in his plan. Sometimes as believers, and I've seen my dad was as a pastor. I got a lot of pastors in my family and things like this. I've seen it over the years. I've seen pastors just wear themselves out. And it's almost like the story of Jethro there with Moses. They wear themselves out. They're doing so much. They are it. I'm it. And in my church, everybody comes to me. I pray for everybody. I lead and teach everybody. I am it. Sometimes that's the pastor's fault because the pastor wants to be seen as the guy.
Yep.
You know? And so I think for leadership fatigue, the key is effective and efficient delegation of authority, just like we saw with Jethro there, doing that efficiently. But the key thing is hearing from God, because God will make sure that that happens. He will bring people like he did with Moses. He'll bring Jethro in to say, here's what you need to do. And just understanding that God is with you, he will give you those times of rest that you need. Because I tell you what, I had a brother who was a pastor, and he broke his leg. He was talking about all the things one day. That's why God put him down to get some rest. And so God will do these divinely inspired things to make sure you don't enter into leadership fatigue, because leaders don't fatigue. I mean, they don't fatigue. I mean, so if you wear yourself out, you got to start questioning, why am I wearing myself out? Because God he's got rest prepared for you. He's working it in. I make fun of my wife because since we went to Israel, she's very big on her Shabbat. Oh my goodness. Don't destroy my wife's Shabbat. I was like, can you at least answer my text messages on your Shabbat? What, you know?
Yeah.
So, but really,
no, I'm resting.
We've got to have those times where we know God is refreshing us, replenishing us, and that's as important as the call that he's given us to understand that he's given us his divine rest.
Good. Great. Thanks for answering that question. Appreciate it. Hey, and one other thing, would you mind your 5 points?
Sure.
Would you get those typed up and sent to me? Because what we want to do with my 5 characteristics and your 5 points, we want to be able to get that in just a very simple 1-page note form that people can have that corresponds to the stuff that when they can listen to the recording, they'll have that in front of them. That'd be great.
No problem. Yeah, great, easy. You can't do it. It's in a Word document. I can make that happen easily.
Any other questions for Carlen? We're about ready to wrap it up here.
Yeah, this is great. I love it.
Well, let me remind you all as we're wrapping things up that Thursday night you're going to get a chance to hear from Sam Newton on the leadership principles of David, and he just alluded to it a little while ago, the principles of how David dealt with Saul and that whole headship over him. And you're also going to hear from Dr. Al Letting, who is the Vice President of Academic Affairs at Grace School of Theology, who's going to be teaching on the leadership principles of Nehemiah. Should be 2, again, really exciting, good, deep looks at biblical leadership through those 2 biblical leaders. Carlen, I want to thank you so much for joining me tonight, brother. It was wonderful to see you, and just your enthusiasm is infectious. I love listening to you speak. It's really wonderful. And to those of you who joined us, thank you so much for being a part of this, for your chats, for your questions. We really appreciate you. Ephesians said it was what I needed to hear tonight. That is wonderful. Jason said, thank you, great time. Val, you as well. I'm truly enjoying this. Thank you all for chiming in and being a part of our evening tonight. It has really helped make this. This is being recorded. Both of these this evening, they'll be sent out. You'll get an email response if you registered for this, and you'll be able to listen to them again. We'll be sending notes out, posting notes along with that. So all of this should come as a part of the ongoing movement of what we're trying to do through the Grace Center for Spiritual Development. That's bring you good, solid, biblical content, this one related to biblical leadership. Carlen, my friend, thank you again for being with us. The rest of you, we look forward to seeing you Thursday night. Let me pray for us and we'll conclude. Father God, thank you that you would have given us such a rich, rich history of great biblical leaders, flawed men and women, people who have shown their flaws, and yet through that you have shown your majesty, your sovereignty, your strength to show you leading through them. I thank you for the person of Moses. I thank you for the person of Joseph and the incredible principles we've learned tonight. We pray that as we look forward to David and Nehemiah and then look forward to Deborah and Elijah, that you will again unfold further for us principles that we can take and apply, things that we can start to use today as you call us to influence those people around us. God, thank you for the privilege of working with you in this and partnering with you in expanding your kingdom to your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, everyone. Loved having you with us. We'll see you on Thursday. Bye-bye.